Well, welcome, friends. If you don't know me already, I'm Maureen Lopes. I'm going to be trying to be really good with this microphone. And this is the angle for those of you who may not be familiar with that. And the good news is I'm not going to sing into it, though. So I'm a member of New Haven Friends Meeting, Racial Justice Committee. I have also been participating with Hartford Friends Meeting on right relationships of Indigenous people. And we were very moved by the report that came to all of New England Quakers in August this year from a study group that was established to look into the participation of Quakers from New England in the late 1800s into the 20th century in Indigenous boarding schools. Now, I do have written out remarks because I want to keep that short enough that we can have some discussion afterwards. But as I said earlier, Dwight and I do need to leave by 1:15 for a memorial service. But I think we'll have some good time. I will send the remarks, the final version, to Pat to put in the weekly announcement because there are some links in there that I think might be helpful, including a really excellent slideshow from 2022 that was done with the whole background about Indigenous boarding schools. And for me, it's been a heartbreak story that, of course, we were never taught in American history. Slowly but surely, this is part of our truth telling. So let me start with this little quote, I forget where I found it, really summarizes how I feel about history. I am not a historian, I'm a finance person, but this really captures me. We can do better only when we learn from history. When we bury it, we've lost so much learning. First, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the creation in general of Indian boarding schools. There are places along here that I reference pages. The full report has gone out over several weeks in our announcements. If you have not gotten that, just send me a note or I'll attach it again this coming week. So I tried where I'm actually quoting something from the report, I've referenced that. And I thought it'd be interesting just to start with the history of Indigenous peoples in Connecticut. Those peoples inhabited the land for 11,000 years among at least 18 groups before the first European showed up. And of course, their names are still among us. Quinnipiacs, Hammonassets, Mohegans, Tunsis, and Pequots are among those. And the more and more I look at town names as we go along the highways of Connecticut, you go, that must be an Indigenous name. That must be one. And to look into those histories. The first Europeans, who happened to be Dutch, arrived in 1614 just to do trading. And then a quote from the Connecticut Humanities website. For centuries, these tribes had been violently disposed of land, language, kinship, foodways, and religion by the policies and culture of the settler colonialism. And by the end of the U.S. Civil War, there were very few groups of Indigenous people left across New England. I would say my sense is generally Maine has had some remaining groups, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy. And to remember, the land on which we're sitting now, the meeting house, where each of us live in Connecticut, is all stolen land to benefit someone other than the natives who are living on them. Then I'll just move into the basic traumatic relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government of the United States and religious communities. Oh, I'm not saying there were none. Yeah, but very few. That's my description. I mean, I actually did a report for a college class on the Pequots. I mean, they were down to two older women in the 20th century, but now, yeah. So if you could hold comments, then we can get to those. Um, so this is a description of the U.S. federal policy towards indigenous peoples. Forcibly drive out tribes to open more and more land for the Western expanding population. Kim was talking about Indiana. I have relatives in Dayton. Where's Jane? So many of us have connections that happened way before we were born. And a couple of examples were the Mohegans were ultimately driven out of Connecticut, most of them to upstate New York, and then across the Lake Superior, across the Great Lakes. And you may have heard about the Trail of Tears, and that's as early as 1830 when President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, helped push out Indian tribes in Southeast United States out to what was then called the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, basically. That was a general term. So they were driven out Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida. And these were very established tribes at that point. They had been 1830s a little bit later, so they had been, making contact and thought that it was going to be a right relationship. Well, that didn't turn out right. Then a quote: efforts at outright extermination had been tried. Indigenous people had proven too resilient and too costly, both in white blood and treasure. That's from the report. So one of the responses by the government was setting up the reservations. And that's basically what all of Indian Territory became. Many different groups end up in that pretty barren land. Then we get to the administration of President Grant, right after the Civil War. And he was looking for a more peaceful solution than all the wars that had been going on particularly the Great Plains at that point. So trying to establish a policy of assimilation now rather than respectful right relationships. So there wasn't consultation on what would be the best thing. But the goal was to civilize and Christianize strategy to pacify Native people and eliminate barriers to the settlement and exploitation of lands west of the Mississippi. Okay. Now, that notion of civilize and Christianize, you'll see, actually becomes the basis also for Quakers going to do teaching missionary work. They saw educating Native children intended as a humane alternative to the physical annihilation of Indians. There was actually probably reasonable concern that given, another 20 years, there might not have been there might have been people in hiding, but there would not have been indigenous people living in groups and whatever. So following his inauguration in 1869, President Grant called upon cooperating religious denominations to nominate leaders to set up and administer schools to teach English, arithmetic, and farming, and severing them from their land, language, and people. So most of these people had been at least semi-nomadic, and now they were going to turn them into farmers on what land they could be given. And among friends, Orthodox friends volunteered. And I include, for those who aren't familiar with the terms, there's a link to a glossary between Orthodox and Hicksite friends, so you can understand. Many of these were in the Midwest, I would say, rather than New England. But New England friends answered the call, I think is the way to say it. Now, unfortunately, the conditions at these schools varied widely from stern and thank you, to physically and emotionally abusive. The former formal curriculum combined classroom study and manual labor. Indian boarding schools harshly enforced practices meant to sever all connections between children and their families, their Indianness. So it starts out more like day schools in some of the reservations. But then they found the kids would go home, the same day, go home and speak their native language, and the weekends they were at home. So it started moving towards boarding school, take them or encourage their parents to send them for education. Upon arrival at school, students were scrubbed clean, their hair cut short, dressed in European style clothes, and given English names. In many indigenous peoples, long hair, never cutting their hair, was part of their spirituality. So that is more moving than we might think today. So I thought we'd just pause here for a moment to think about what it would have been like with any of the children yourself or the children in your family. Not in every case, but many of these children never saw their families again. An unknown number, because they didn't keep really great records, children died at the schools because it was a place for smallpox and typhoid and all of those other diseases. They would try running away. And then there were some who took that education and did assimilate. I mean, we do have a few who wrote their own biographies of what happened. It's it's kind of a heartbreak about how difficult it has been for tribal members now to try and find those children from history. At the moment, we have the head of the Department of Interior, Deb Halen, Indigenous person from New Mexico, who has been pushing the Bureau of Indian Affairs to come up with whatever they can find in the records. She's done a great job, but of course it needs to continue. For many Native people today, their question is still, what have you done with our children? So now we'll get into New England Quakers. They provided women and men volunteers to staff the government bureaucratic agencies and schools. If government's involved, you got to have agencies and people to do that. They sent a steady flow of funds, books, clothing, and other supplies, and articulated intellectual and moral principles that shaped and justified harsh measures that became standard practices in many of the schools. So that goes back to basing it on both civilization, Western civilization, and Christianization. Friends thought cultural erasure and the traumatic disruptions of kinship ties was the necessary and loving solution to the devastation inflicted on Indigenous people. The sources for the volunteers who prepared this report, and when you look at the report, they explain how this process was channeled. We're not the only Christian denomination in the country that's doing this research. It comes from a challenge. But our researchers went back to the minutes of meetings, whether at the higher level of New England or individual meetings. And the good news is we have those minutes back 365 years or something like that. And they're up in University of Massachusetts now, which makes them a little more easier. And they've been scanning all of them. So they have the help of archivists right there at UMass. What is missing, and this would take tremendous effort, is any personal correspondence. This is probably being held in small collections somewhere, families or whatever, people who might have disagreed with this policy among Quakers, spoken out at their monthly meeting and said, I'm not really sure we should be doing this. We're just thinking probability there were people who did that. But they have not risen up in minutes, which reminded me that if minutes, particularly on a controversial subject, are just reflecting the final outcome, sometimes we're losing the sense of, well, what did it take to get there? So one of those little pieces of learning. One thing that Quakers can do now, and I have the hyperlink, is Indigenous people have been trying for years to get Congress to set up a Truth and Healing Commission on, particularly on boarding schools. And our Friends Committee on National Legislation has a standard letter that you can send to your congressman. Both of our state senators have supported it. I think all of our reps also, but no. So it's worthwhile, even if Connecticut representatives are supporting it, just to keep pushing on it. So it's something, and there's a hyperlink on this. So that's sort of the overview. So taking the first 5 pages of that report, sort of the background, and then the report gets into what happened in relation to particular tribes. There were 2, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. New England Quakers ended up with, if you're just thinking about looking at Oklahoma, the far northeast corner, just a tiny bit of land in terms of all this land. But so there was some organization, I guess, from the federal level on which denominations got what part and which peoples to work with. So maybe so I'll open it right now for any questions. But then what I'd really like us to do is to go in a discernment mode about what is it we think we're doing good doing today that may have incredible long term, particularly who are the marginalized people in our society that we don't go to and say, we're thinking of doing this project on the land that, yes, our town owns, but who else can we talk to that has a different relationship with the land? It's very moving. I really have had this sense now of, what if those white people never came and it was just indigenous people on the land? This earth, or at least this part of the earth, would have been taken care of, because it was being taken care of for 11, 12,000, maybe even 20,000 years. Or at least if we had been smart enough as Europeans to learn from the people on the land. But those days are past, but what can we do now? So question.